It began with a voice faint, but distinct, drifting through the narrow hallway of a house that had stood quiet for decades. In early autumn 2023, a couple named Martin and Elise Weaver bought a modest, ivy-covered home in Henley-on-Thames, Oxfordshire. The listing mentioned that it once belonged to Dusty Springfield, the British soul legend known for son of a preacher man. The realtor had said it casually, almost proudly, as if the name alone could justify the slightly inflated price. Elise, a music teacher, was thrilled. Martin, a surveyor, was less impressed but admitted the place had charm, the sort of subdued elegance that felt frozen in another time. Their first few nights were calm. The air inside smelled faintly of lavender and dust, and the walls seemed to absorb sound rather than echo it. But then, on the fifth night, Elise heard something while preparing tea. A hum. A soft, sustained note coming from the old study, where they'd left the window cracked open. When she entered, the room was empty. The sound faded as if someone had simply stopped singing. She didn't mention it to Martin at first. But the next evening, when she was alone again, the same note returned, clearer now, in perfect pitch. Elise leaned against the doorframe, whispering, "Hello!" The hum broke into silence. By the end of the week, small things began to change. The framed photo of Dusty Springfield, left by the previous owner as a quirky keepsake, was turned slightly on its hook every morning. One night, when Elise couldn't sleep, she swore she heard someone humming "The Look of Love" through the thin walls between the study and the main bedroom. Martin, practical and unsentimental, chalked it up to old plumbing, maybe a whistling vent. "Sound travels strangely in these old houses," he said, tapping a section of the plaster. "You can get resonance from pipes, electrical wiring, even air pressure shifts." But then came the recording. Elise, curious, set her phone on the shelf one afternoon while she taught piano in the next room. She wanted to catch the hum again, proof that she wasn't imagining it. When she played the recording later, the air seemed to leave her lungs. At first, it was only static and faint environmental noise, but then, through the hiss, a woman's voice. Gentle, textured, unmistakably singing, "You don't have to say you love me," and stopping midline, as if interrupted. When she showed it to Martin, he frowned. "That's not possible. It's probably some stray signal, a radio bleed or Bluetooth interference." But he listened again, this time through headphones. The phrasing, the timbre, it was eerily close to Dusty's voice. Elise reached out to a local historian who documented the musicians who had lived in the area during the 60s. He confirmed that Springfield had indeed owned the house briefly before moving to London. She'd written notes for a few unreleased songs there. The historian mentioned something else, too. Neighbors once claimed Dusty used to sing late at night with the windows open, her voice carrying softly into the street. That night, Elise stood in the garden beneath those same windows. The autumn wind moved through the trees, brushing the tall grass. And then, faint but clear, she heard it again. A single sustained note, perfectly pitched, hovering in the night air until it dissolved into silence. The next morning, she noticed the study door slightly ajar. On the piano, the old one that had come with the house, lay a page of sheet music she'd never seen before. It was blank except for a few faintly penciled words in the corner. "In this room, the silence still sings." Elise felt a chill, not of fear, but of something almost reverent. She knew then that the voice wasn't trying to scare them. It was trying to be remembered. The next week passed in a haze of subtle unease. Elise no longer felt entirely alone in the house. Even when Martin was at work and the afternoon light slanted quietly across the wooden floors, the air seemed to hold a density, a faint charge like before a summer storm. She told herself it was just suggestion, memories of Dusty's songs echoing in her head, but the moments between daylight and dusk became increasingly heavy. One afternoon, Elise decided to play the piano in the study, to see what would happen if music filled the space again. The instrument was old, slightly out of tune, but still held a fragile warmth. As her fingers moved through a soft progression, she noticed something peculiar. Each time she stopped playing, there was an echo, not of her notes, but of a different melody, a slow descending line that wasn't hers. It came from the far end of the room, from near the wall where Dusty's portrait hung. She froze, listening. The faint tune faded, but she knew it had been real. It wasn't a perfect ghostly imitation. Not cinematic or dramatic, more like someone quietly humming along, slightly out of time, hesitant, as though remembering. That evening, she convinced Martin to help her test it. They placed 2 recorders in the study and another in the hallway. Martin spoke loudly for the timestamp, Thursday, October 12th, 10:47 p.m., test 1, and they both stood still. The room was utterly silent except for the occasional pop of the fireplace. After 15 minutes, they stopped the recording. When they played it back, there was nothing for the first several minutes. Then, faintly, beneath the ambient hiss, came a sound neither of them could place. Not a hum this time, more like the soft drag of a foot on wood, followed by what might have been a breath. A single note of something melodic rose and dissolved. Elise's heart beat in her throat. She watched Martin's expression harden into concern. "It could be interference," he said quickly, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe a passing car outside," the vibration echoing. "There were no cars," Elise whispered. "Listen to the pitch. It's the same as before." They spent the next hours trying to rationalize it. Martin checked the vents, the electrical panel, even the subfloor. He found nothing unusual, but something about the house, its calm, polite stillness, began to feel different. The walls seemed to retain the day's sound, releasing it slowly at night. That weekend, Elise visited the local archives. She found an old interview clip recorded decades earlier with Dusty Springfield talking about writing sessions in Henley. In it, Dusty mentioned how she liked to rehearse near an upstairs window, because the air made my voice feel freer, softer, like the sound could travel forever. The quote stayed with Elise. That night she stood again beneath that same window, letting the breeze lift the curtain as she whispered the words aloud. She began to keep a small journal of every incident, the times, the sounds, how she felt. On some nights there was nothing. On others, the humming returned, faint and steady. Once, while recording, she thought she caught a whisper, her own name. But when she listened again, it was gone. Martin grew uneasy with her obsession. "You're giving this place too much power," he said one morning, pouring coffee without meeting her eyes. "Old houses creak, they resonate. You can't turn that into meaning every time." "I know what I hear," Elise answered softly. The tension between them grew. She started sleeping in the guest room near the study, telling herself it was for observation. But part of her wanted to feel closer to whatever presence lingered there. The nights were long and slow. Sometimes she would wake to the faint smell of Dusty's favorite perfume, jasmine and vetiver. According to the biography she'd been reading, it would appear for seconds, then vanish, leaving only the familiar scent of the old wood and the cold air drifting through the vents. One morning, she found footprints in the dust beneath the piano. They were faint, bare, and small, too small for Martin. She brushed them away, telling herself it must have been her own, somehow left before cleaning. But deep down, she knew they hadn't been there the day before. Still, fear never quite overtook her. What she felt instead was sadness, a slow, aching empathy for the invisible voice still trapped in its own melody. Elise began playing Dusty's songs on the piano every night, softly, with the lamps dimmed. And each time, after the final note, she would pause, listening to the silence stretch across the room, waiting for the faint, hesitant harmony that sometimes rose in reply. Martin tried to avoid the study altogether. Yet even he couldn't deny that one evening, as he passed the door, he heard a faint sound from inside, a woman's voice, fragile and distant, humming just under her breath. It wasn't frightening. It was beautiful in a way that unsettled him more deeply than any scream could have. He didn't tell Elise, but later that night, when she left the recorder running, he lay awake listening to the wind slide across the roof, the faint vibration of glass in the window frame, and somewhere beneath it all the echo of that same melody, as if the house itself was remembering. Elise began to move through the house with more purpose, as if she were mapping an invisible pattern that no one else could see. Each creak in the floorboards, every gust that brushed past a curtain, felt deliberate part of some fragile dialogue between her and the house. She no longer feared the nights. They had become a kind of quiet communion. When Martin went to bed, she would remain in the study, her hands resting lightly on the piano keys, waiting. The recordings had started to reveal more than either of them expected. On one from late October, a faint chord progression could be heard, perfectly in tune with the piano, though no one had played it. Elise had been reading in another room at the time. When she played it back, she felt her pulse quicken. The sequence matched an unfinished demo Dusty had once recorded but never released. Something Elise had found online in a rare compilation. The same tempo, the same lingering melancholy. It was impossible, and yet it was there. She began to test it methodically. She placed recorders in separate rooms. One in the hallway, one by the staircase, one beneath the old window in the study. She noted times, weather, and sounds from outside. On quiet nights, she'd even turn off the fridge and heating to eliminate every possible interference. The house responded as if aware of the attention. It grew quieter, almost holding its breath. But when the first heavy rain arrived, everything changed. That night, the tapping on the window panes became rhythmic, almost musical. Elise stood in the doorway, listening as water slid down the glass. Beneath the storm's low rumble, a faint melody emerged, so fragile she thought it might be her imagination. She walked slowly toward the piano and pressed one key A. The tone hung in the air, and from somewhere in the walls, like an echo delayed by time, came the next note, a half-step higher. It was a call and response. She played again, softer this time, and again the answer came. Her hands trembled. She whispered into the room, "Dusty, is that you?" The air shifted. A faint breeze moved her hair, though the windows were shut tight. She waited, but there was no reply, only the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Yet when she turned back to the piano, she saw that the topmost page of the blank sheet music had been disturbed, lifted slightly, as though brushed by an unseen hand. The pencil she'd left beside it had rolled across the wood. She reached out and found, faintly etched into the margin, a single curved line of musical notation, 3 descending notes. When Martin saw it the next morning, he frowned. "You probably wrote that without thinking," he said. "It's easy to forget small things." But Elise knew her own handwriting. This was different. Softer, looping, written with a kind of fluid grace she couldn't imitate. The more she tried to explain, the more distant Martin became. He started spending weekends away on surveying trips, leaving her alone in the house. And though the loneliness was heavy, she also felt that something within the walls had begun to trust her. The sounds grew clearer, the perfume stronger, the melodies more confident. It was as if the house itself was remembering its own voice through her. One afternoon, she invited a sound engineer friend, Ben, to visit. She told him about the phenomenon without using the word haunting. He arrived with a portable setup, a laptop, and a few sensitive microphones. "Old houses act like resonators," he said, setting up equipment around the room. "Every cavity, every hollow wall creates micro-echoes. You could mistake it for singing if your brain wants to." For 2 hours, they recorded silence. Nothing happened. Elise felt foolish, almost embarrassed. But when they played it back later that evening, Ben grew pale. Between the low frequencies of the room tone was a series of faint harmonics too precise to be random. "That's structured sound," he murmured. "Not speech, but musical." He zoomed in on the waveform. The pattern repeated in an almost human rhythm: breath, pause, breath. It's like someone vocalizing from inside the walls. That night, Elise couldn't sleep. She lay awake listening to the old beams contract with the cold, the sigh of air through the ducts. Then came the faintest echo of a chord, a soft F major that lingered, wrapped in the hush of the house. She sat up, her heart thudding. From the study came another sound, a chair leg scraping, like someone shifting slightly in their seat. She walked down the hallway barefoot, careful not to make a sound. The door to the study was ajar. Inside, the piano lid was open. Moonlight spilled across the keys, pale and silver. The scent of jasmine was strong now, real, unmistakable. For a long moment, she thought she saw movement by the window, a subtle shift in the air, the outline of someone standing there, head slightly bowed, as though listening to something far away. Elise didn't move. She just whispered, almost reverently, "I can hear you." The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full of presence, like the breath held between two notes of a song that never ends. And though the air was cold enough to make her skin prickle, she felt no fear, only a strange, aching peace, as if the house had finally found someone willing to listen. The next morning, Martin returned to find her asleep at the piano, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. The recorder beside her still ran, the red light blinking softly. He pressed stop and glanced at the timecode. The file had been recording for over 6 hours. And somewhere in that long stretch of silence, deep between the hours, there would be, he didn't yet know it, a moment when another voice joined hers, faint and warm, singing just beneath the sound of the rain. When Martin finally listened to that long recording, it was out of quiet worry rather than curiosity. Elise had been distant lately, gentle but unreachable, as if part of her mind lived in another room he couldn't enter. She spent her nights in the study and slept in bursts through the day. There were moments when she would stop mid-sentence, tilting her head as though catching a note no one else could hear. He sat alone that evening with headphones on, the room dim except for the desk lamp. At first there was only static, the whisper of air through the microphone. Then came the faint creak of the floorboards, Elise shifting in her seat. After that, silence. But at the 53-minute mark, a sound began to form, a low, resonant hum. It was soft, feminine, perfectly in tune. And then another voice joined Elise's. Her tone trembled at first, then steadied, weaving around the other melody. Martin's throat tightened. The two voices blended like water and wind, one alive, one impossibly distant. It was unmistakably Dusty's, that velvety mezzo timbre, shaded with breath, as if she were standing only a few feet from the microphone. He took off the headphones, heart pounding, the echo of that harmony still alive in his ears. He didn't tell Elise what he'd heard. She looked fragile that morning, the way light caught the hollows beneath her eyes. Instead, he said quietly, "Maybe it's time we took a break from the house." Elise smiled faintly. "You don't understand. It's not dangerous. It's beautiful." Days passed with a fragile calm. Martin arranged for them to stay at his sister's cottage in Bath for a while, but Elise never packed. She said she couldn't leave while something unfinished was still in the air. On her last evening, she lit a single candle beside the piano and opened the lid again. The night outside was calm, the garden glistening with dew. She began to play the progression from the recording, those same slow descending chords. Her hands moved gently, deliberately, each note hanging in the room like a sigh. And then, between her phrases, came another voice, faint, tender, completing the melody. It rose and fell with her, perfectly phrased, as if Dusty herself were guiding her hands. The candle flickered, and the air thickened with perfume, that same jasmine and vetiver, so strong it almost felt visible. Elise's eyes filled with tears. "You're not trapped," she whispered. "You're remembered." When the final chord faded, she left the piano open and walked to the window. The moonlight lay across the garden wall, pale and quiet. Somewhere beyond, a dog barked once, then silence. For a moment she thought she heard footsteps behind her, soft, bare, crossing the wooden floor. She turned, but the room was empty. Only the candle flame wavered slightly, as if brushed by passing air. The next morning, Martin woke to find her gone. Her coat was missing, and the front door stood slightly ajar. He found her sitting on the garden bench beneath the window, wrapped in a blanket, calm and distant, as if she'd just returned from a long journey. She looked up and smiled. "It's quiet now," she said. "She's finished her song." In the weeks that followed, the house grew still again. The faint perfume disappeared. The walls stopped sighing. The recorders captured nothing but ordinary domestic noise, the settling of wood, the wind outside. Elise seemed lighter, her focus returning, though she still played the piano each evening. Months later, as they prepared to sell the house, Martin went through the last of the recordings. He planned to delete them, but one file caught his attention, a short clip from that final night. He pressed play. There was a brief hiss, then a woman's voice, clear and close to the microphone. "Thank you." Just that. One word. Then the tape ended with the sound of the piano lid closing. He kept the file but never spoke of it again. The new owners were a retired couple who loved the house's calm, old-fashioned charm. They replaced the curtains, repainted the study, and found the piano tuner's card in a drawer. When the man lifted the lid to test the keys, he paused. The final note on the far right had been marked with a faint pencil line, 3 descending notes, barely visible, just like the ones Elise had once found. They sounded it out together, curious. The chord that followed was unexpectedly sweet, perfectly resolved. Sometimes, when the evenings grew long and quiet, the new owners said the house seemed to hold a warmth, not heat, but something softer, a kind of living memory that hummed faintly in the background. The old piano, even when untouched, seemed to resonate with a tone that hovered just beyond hearing, as though someone, somewhere, was still rehearsing one last song under the moonlit window. And in the village, the locals still mentioned the story of the singer who once lived there, whose voice had drifted through those very walls decades ago, and of the woman who listened deeply enough to bring it back. No one spoke of hauntings anymore. They called it an echo, a perfect, lingering note that refused to fade completely from the air.